The sun was setting over the Apache camp when the elders gathered around the fire, their faces painted in shadows and firelight. Nalin stood before them, her hands bound, her head high, her eyes fixed on a point beyond them, beyond the tents, beyond the mountains that marked the edge of her world. She had known this day was coming. She had known it the moment she refused the man they had chosen for her, the man whose father held power, the man whose pride she had wounded with her silence. She had chosen herself, and for that, they would make her pay. The chief spoke first, his voice carrying across the camp, calling the people to witness. He spoke of obedience, of tradition, of the laws that had held the tribe together for generations. He spoke of Nalin's refusal, her defiance, her pride. He spoke of the punishment that must follow. She listened without flinching, her hands steady at her sides, her face a mask of calm. She had prepared herself for this. She had walked the desert in her mind 100 times, had imagined the heat, the thirst, the loneliness. She was not afraid. She was something worse. She was empty. The judgment was swift. She would be banished, cast out from the tribe, forbidden to return, forbidden to marry, forbidden to claim any kinship with the people who had raised her. She would walk into the desert with nothing but the clothes on her back, and she would not look back. The elders pronounced the words, and the people murmured, and Nalin felt something inside her crack. Not her pride, that was still intact, still burning, but something deeper, something that had believed, until this moment, that she belonged somewhere. She turned, and she walked, and she did not look back. The desert swallowed her whole. She walked through the night, through the cold that came after the sun went down, through the silence that pressed against her ears like water. She walked until her legs gave out, until she collapsed against a rock, until she slept a dreamless sleep that felt more like death than rest. In the morning, the sun found her, and she woke to a world that was empty, vast, indifferent. She had no water, no food, no shelter. She had nothing but her name and her silence, and the memory of a fire that had once been home. 3 days passed. She found water in a seep that her grandmother had shown her years ago, a hidden spring that bubbled up from the rock and disappeared into the sand. She found berries on a thorny bush, bitter but sustaining. She found a cave in the cliffs, shallow but sheltering. She was surviving, but surviving was not living. She moved through the desert like a ghost, leaving no trace, making no sound, waiting for something she could not name. The sun burned her skin, the wind dried her lips, and the loneliness settled into her bones like a sickness. He found her on the 4th day, a lone rider on a dun horse, moving slowly through the canyon, his hat low against the sun, his eyes scanning the cliffs for cattle that had strayed. He was not looking for her. He had no reason to be, but he saw her there, standing in the shadow of a rock, her dark hair blowing in the wind, her face turned toward the horizon. He reined in his horse, and for a long moment, neither moved. He was a stranger, a white man, a cowboy in Apache territory. She should have run, but something in his face made her stay. He dismounted slowly, his hands visible, his movements careful. He knew the signs of a woman who had been running, who had been hurt, who had learned to fear men who approached too fast. He stopped a few feet away, his hat in his hands, his face open. "Are you lost?" he asked, and his voice was low, gentle, the voice of a man who had learned to be quiet in a world that was too loud. She looked at him, at his weathered face, his kind eyes, the way he held himself like a man who had nothing to prove. "No," she said. "I am exactly where I'm supposed to be." He did not ask her name. He did not ask where she came from, what she was doing alone in the desert, why she looked at him with eyes that held more grief than fear. He simply took off his canteen, handed it to her, and waited while she drank. Then he offered her food-dried meat, hard bread, and watched her eat with the careful attention of a man who knew what hunger looked like. When she had finished, he mounted his horse and extended his hand. "I have a ranch a few miles from here," he said. "You'll be safe there." You can rest, recover, leave when you're ready." She took his hand, and he pulled her up behind him. She had never ridden a horse before, had never been this close to a man who was not her kin. She held onto his waist, felt the warmth of him through his shirt, smelled the dust and leather and sweat that clung to him. He rode slowly, carefully, as if he was carrying something fragile. The desert opened around them, vast and empty, but for the first time in 4 days, she did not feel alone. She did not know his name, did not know where he was taking her, did not know what he wanted from her, but she knew, with a certainty that surprised her, that she was safe. His ranch was a small cabin at the edge of a valley, nestled against a ridge of red rock, with a spring that ran clear and cold and a garden that struggled against the dry soil. He helped her down from the horse, showed her to a small room at the back of the cabin, left her with a blanket and a basin of water, and a silence that felt like kindness. She slept for a day and a night, and when she woke, she found him at the table, a pot of coffee between them, waiting. He did not ask her story. He simply poured her a cup and waited for her to find the words. She told him in pieces, the way a wound must be cleaned slowly, carefully, a little at a time. She told him about her mother, who had died when she was young, about her father, who had followed soon after. She told him about the elders who had raised her, the laws they had taught her, the man they had chosen for her. She told him about the refusal, the judgment, the walk into the desert. He listened without interrupting, his hands wrapped around his cup, his eyes steady on her face. When she finished, he was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "You were brave." She stayed, not because she had nowhere else to go, though that was true. Not because she owed him anything, though she felt that too. She stayed because something in this quiet valley, this small cabin, this man who asked nothing of her, felt like a place she could rest. She learned his routines, the way he woke before dawn, the way he worked until the sun went down, the way he sat on the porch in the evenings and watched the stars appear. She learned to cook his food, tend his garden, mend his clothes. She learned that his name was Caleb, that he had come west 10 years ago, that he had buried a wife and a child in a place he never spoke of. The weeks passed and something grew between them that neither of them named. He taught her to ride, his hands steady on her waist as she mounted, his voice patient as she learned to guide the horse. She taught him the songs her grandmother had sung, the stories her people had told for generations. They worked together, ate together, sat together in the evenings, watching the light fade from the desert. And slowly, quietly, the wall she had built around her heart began to crack. She found herself watching him when he did not see her, found herself smiling when he came in from the fields, found herself wishing for something she had been forbidden to want. One evening, as the sun set behind the mountains and the desert turned to gold, he found her at the spring, washing her hair in the cool water. She did not hear him approach, did not know he was there until she felt his gaze on her skin. She turned, her hair dripping, her face flushed, and saw him standing a few feet away, his hat in his hands, his eyes dark. "I'm sorry," he said, and his voice was rough. "I didn't mean to." She shook her head, and something in her face must have told him it was all right, because he did not leave. He stayed, and she finished washing her hair, and they walked back to the cabin together, the silence between them full of things neither could say. That night, they sat on the porch as they always did, watching the stars appear one by one, but something was different. He was closer than usual, his shoulder almost touching hers, his hand resting on the rail between them. She could feel the warmth of him, could smell the leather and dust that clung to his clothes, could hear the soft rhythm of his breathing. "I never told anyone about my wife," he said, and his voice was low, private. "I never wanted to, but I want to tell you." She turned to look at him, and in his face, she saw the grief he had carried for 10 years, the loneliness he had hidden behind his work, his silence, his distance. "Tell me," she said. He told her about a woman named Sarah, a child named Hannah, a fever that had taken them both in a single week. He told her about the years that followed, the emptiness, the guilt, the decision to come west because the east was too full of memories. He told her about the ranch, the work, the long nights when he had told himself he was better off alone. "I thought I had forgotten how to feel," he said. "I thought that part of me was dead. And then I found you in the desert, and I realized I had been waiting for you. I just didn't know it." She reached for his hand, her fingers finding his in the darkness, and he did not pull away. His hand was rough, calloused, warm, and when his fingers closed around hers, she felt something shift in her chest, a wall coming down, a door opening, a fear she had carried for so long finally releasing its hold. "They told me I could never marry," she said, and her voice was barely a whisper. "They told me I would die alone." He lifted her hand to his lips, pressed a kiss to her knuckles, and looked at her with eyes that held more than she had ever thought she would receive. "They were wrong," he said. They were married in the spring, in the valley where the wildflowers bloomed yellow and purple, and the desert seemed to hold its breath. There was no preacher, no ceremony, no witnesses except the mountains and the sky and the horses that grazed in the meadow. They stood together at the spring where she had washed her hair, where he had first seen her without her armor, and they made promises that needed no paper to bind them. She would be his partner, his equal, his home. He would be her shelter, her strength, her future. When they kissed, the wind rose up from the desert, and it seemed to her that her grandmother was somewhere in that wind, singing. The years that followed were not easy, but they were full. They built a life together, a ranch that grew from a small cabin to a spread that stretched across the valley. She learned to ride like a vaquero, to rope and brand and drive cattle. He learned her language, her songs, the stories her grandmother had told. They had children, a daughter with her dark hair and his stubborn chin, a son with his patience and her fire. And in the evenings, when the work was done and the desert was quiet, they sat on the porch together, watching the stars appear, and she felt something she had never thought she would feel: peace. On the night of their 10th anniversary, she found him at the spring, standing where he had stood when she was washing her hair, looking up at the moon. She came up behind him, wrapped her arms around his waist, pressed her face against his back. He covered her hands with his, and for a long time, neither spoke. "Do you remember," he said finally, "the day I found you in the desert?" She smiled against his shirt. "I remember thinking you were a ghost, a man that kind could not be real." He turned in her arms, pulled her against his chest, looked down at her with eyes that had not changed in 10 years. "I was a ghost," he said. "Before you, I was a ghost." She reached up, touched his face, traced the lines that time had carved there. And now, he kissed her then, there by the spring, under the moon, with the desert spread out around them like a sea of light. "Now I am alive," he said, "because of you." They walked back to the cabin together, her hand in his, and in the window, she could see the light that meant their children were waiting. Their home was waiting, their life was waiting. She had been cast out of one world and found another. She had been forbidden to love and found a love that would last forever. And somewhere in the wind that blew across the desert, she heard her grandmother singing, and she knew that she had finally, after all these years, come home.